Ahoy, and welcome aboard the Afro Tales podcast. I am your Griot, Amon Mazingo, here to guide you through captivating tales rooted in the histories of indigenous and African-descended peoples across the Americas and the Caribbean. But the journey does not end there. I, Chef, will share a delicious recipe inspired by the stories you have just heard. So, with no further ado, let us set sail on this new age of exploration. Nat Turner. Benjamin Turner owned a farm in Southampton County, Virginia, near the Dismal Swamp, where a group of runaways known as the Outliers lived. These runaways, unlike the Maroons who tried to establish distance and hidden communities, were bandits who, under the cover of night, slipped back to the plantations to steal and terrorize both whites and blacks. Although they were outlaws, the Outliers were free, and Nat Turner's father was probably one of them. Nat Turner was born on October 2nd, 1800, the year of Gabriel's conspiracy and Denmark Vessie's freedom. Nat's paternal grandmother, old Bridget, helped raise him after his father ran away, probably to the Dismal Swamp. Nat's mother, Nancy, was from Africa, brought to Virginia in 1795, and purchased by Turner in 1799. "They strengthened me," Turner said of his family. Old Bridget was wise and gave the boy her knowledge of roots and herbs for healing purposes. Nat's mother believed in the old ways from Africa. She believed in reading prophetic signs. She must have seen something in Nat's birth, because according to him, she told me I was here for some great purpose. In 1810, Turner's master died, and his son Samuel became his master. In 1822, Nat Turner married Cherry, but was then sold to Thomas Moore for $400 and taken to his farm near Flat Swamp in the western part of the county. Giles Reese, a neighbor of Moore's, bought Cherry. When Moore died in 1828, 28-year-old Nat Turner became the property of Moore's 9-year-old son, Putnam. Some sources state Putnam was an infant. The widow Sally Moore then married Joseph Travis, who became master of the house in 1829. Thus, in 1831, Nat Turner, though legally still owned by the child Putnam, was under the authority of Joseph Travis. How a slave was treated was dictated by the master's own belief and personality. If he was a cruel person by nature, he was cruel to his slaves as well. If he was prone to be kind and fair, he might deal with his slaves in the same manner. Against the advice of some masters, Benjamin and Samuel Turner had allowed their slaves to worship with the whites, but in a separate seat arrangement. As a child, Nat had attended church regularly, and in the process he had learned to read and write. He also thought he might like to become a preacher himself. When Nat was in his early teens, he began having dreams. Before long, his dreams were daylight visions. In one, as he described it, white spirits and black spirits were engaged in a battle, and the sun was in darkness. The thunder rolled in the heavens, and blood flowed in the streams. And I heard a voice saying, "Such is your luck, such you are called to see, and let it come rough and smooth. You must surely bear it." His ability to see things made Turner special among the slaves. They looked up to him and sought his advice. With the knowledge his grandmother had taught him about healing roots and herbs, Turner became a well-respected root doctor. He was a fine preacher as well. He was a loner, never drank, smoked, or swore. In all ways, he was even-tempered, calmed, and helpful. Sometimes Nat ran away to the woods where he could meditate and read. He always came back, so his master never worried much about where he was or how long he was gone. Contrary to what people said of him, he was not a maniac, full of rage and anger. He was a man with a purpose, and that purpose was freedom, and he had a plan. On Monday, August 22nd, 1831, Nat Turner and 6 fellow slaves began an insurrection that would rock the foundation upon which slavery was built. After Turner was captured, some months later, Thomas R. Gray, a lawyer, local horse breeder, and owner of Round Hill Plantation, northeast of Jerusalem, interviewed Turner before and during his trial. Later, Gray published The Confessions of Nat Turner, a pamphlet containing the story of Nat Turner's rebellion from his own point of view. Some say Gray was motivated by the prospect of making money, for he was in deep debt. Others say he wanted to be part of history, and still others felt he was genuinely interested in getting the story. For whatever reason, Gray was inspired to write The Confessions of Nat Turner. Give us a great deal of information about the man. According to Turner, he had been divinely inspired to lead a rebellion. He said when he walked through the field, he saw blood in the leaves, and he heard the wailing of voices in the winds. When he saw a sign in the heavens, and the seal was removed from my lips, and I communicated the great works laid out for me to do. This is how the insurrection came about according to his confession. Nat said since he was considered a preacher, he was allowed to attend funerals and worship services with his master's permission. Nat used this opportunity to recruit men to join him. At first, he set July 4th, 1831 as the day of attack, but he became ill, probably from anxiety. The time passed. Haunted by indecision and doubt, Turner delayed the attack again. Then, on August 13th, there was an eclipse of the sun. This was Turner's last sign. The black spot had passed over the sun. So would the blacks pass over the earth. He set August 22nd as the day of the revolt. The date was 40 years to the day of the slave uprising that launched in the Haitian Revolution. On the night of August 21st, Turner, along with the slaves named Henry, Hart Travis, Nelson Williams, and Sam Francis, had a barbecue near Giles Reese's farm, Cabin Pond. At midnight, according to plan, they went to the Travis place, where they killed the family, took all the weapons, ammunition, and horses they could find, and recruited several slaves to join them. Moving to the next house, they did the same thing. Their best ally was darkness and surprise. But even as they left the Travis farm, one of the slaves had slipped away and hurried to Nathaniel Francis's farm to warn him. Turner and his rebel army marched toward the town of Jerusalem across Nottoway River. There, he hoped to make the army supply depot. Once the arms were captured, Turner planned to raid the larger plantations, recruit others, then escape into the dismal swamp, where they could find a community and lead guerrilla warfare on the plantations. Turner's numbers had increased to about 50 mounted and armed slaves. At James Park's farm, less than 3 miles from Jerusalem, Turner's men met with armed opposition. In addition, a larger militia unit arrived within the half hour. Some of Turner's men scattered. Several were wounded and captured. Several more were killed. Turner retreated in order to regroup. The roads were blocked to Jerusalem now, so Turner's only hope was to hit the larger plantations where he might get fresh recruits. Doubling back to Belfield in Greensville County, Turner, with about 36 men at his side, exchanged volleys with the militia at Major Thomas Ridley's plantation. Once again, Turner's men suffered hits and some ran away. Needing to rest, Turner stopped to sleep. Many of his men used this opportunity to slip away. When he woke, Turner had less than 20 men still ready to stand with him. In desperation, Turner moved against Dr. Simon Blunt's plantation, but he ran into stiff resistance there. 3 of his men were killed. At about 10 o'clock that morning, Turner sent his last 4 men to 4 different farms with the hopes that they could get recruits. They were to meet him at Cabin Pond with whoever would come back. On Wednesday morning, when Turner arrived, there was no one there except a militia patrol. "On this, I gave up hope for the present," he said. And he made his way to a nearby cave where he stayed for almost 6 weeks. While Turner was still at large, the South fell into a fit of fear and outrage. Information about Nat Turner's rebellion has always been exaggerated by both blacks and whites. Whites in Petersburg, Virginia, reported about 500 slaves were marching their way. People were sure that Turner and his army waiting in the swamps ready to sweep down on people and murder them in their sleep. The thought of old Nat coming in the night kept more than a few masters awake at night, a slave told a traveler at the time. Certainly, that blacks could not have conceived or carried out such a revolt by themselves led the authorities to start looking for whites who might have helped. They were poised and ready to find a conspirator anywhere they could, and it led to some unfortunate situations involving innocent people. An Englishman was overheard to say that the blacks, like any other man, are entitled their freedom. He was dragged from the stagecoach, stripped naked, beaten, then forced to walk into town. A poor white man was caught with a copy of William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator, an abolitionist newspaper, in his home, and was thrown into jail and charged with sedition. Much of the worry was based on the unknown extent of the rebellion. One slaveholder reported that the slaves were out of control over in Sampson County and Dublin County in North Carolina. In Alabama, there were stories about Indian and black conspiracies. Violation of white womanhood were a particular concern. The fact is, women and children had been killed, but none were raped. According to historian Eugene Genovese, in the slave revolts of the hemisphere as a whole, rape occurred rarely despite the blacks having had extreme provocation in the constant violation of their own women by whites. No one has found evidence of a single rape during the revolts in the United States. Virginia Governor John Floyd's proclamation of September 17, 1831, offered $500 for the capture of Nat Turner. He was described as the contriver and leader of the late insurrection. Stories had made Turner seem like a giant, but he was only about 5 feet 6 inches tall, and according to the wanted poster, he had several distinguishing scars. One on his temple, caused by a mule kick, and one near his right wrist by a blow. Turner managed to elude an extensive manhunt until mid-October, when 2 slaves were out hunting and their dog discovered his camp. The slaves recognized Turner and fled. Knowing he could not stay there, he found another hiding place underneath a fallen tree. He was pursued for several more weeks before Benjamin Phipps captured Turner on Sunday, October 30th, and took him to jail. He pled not guilty because he didn't feel guilty. After hearing evidence, Judge Jeremiah Cobb called for the prisoner to rise. Turner, a man with broad shoulders and thinning hair, pulled himself straight to receive his sentence, death. He never flinched. Turner was hanged November 11th, 1831. Stories about Turner's borderline on the bizarre. The most controversial event surrounding Turner's death was about what happened to his body. Some whites swore that on the bottom of his foot there appeared a W. Those who saw it said it might have stood for war. A local doctor dissected his body to see if there was some biological reason for his rebellious nature. Parts of Turner's body were then passed out as souvenirs. In the quarters, slaves told the story that Turner said it would storm after his death, and it did rain, followed by a long dry spell. Folks started calling the drought Nat's Revenge. Naturally, contrasting tales grew up around his name and his deeds. Among whites, he was feared and hated. Slaves honored him. Slave owners forbade slaves to speak his name, and they were not allowed to name their children Nat or Turner. And to make it clear to all future Nat Turners, John Hampton Pleasants made the slaveholders' position quite clear. In the Richmond Constitutional Whig, Pleasants wrote, "Let the fact not be doubted by those whom it most concerns, that other such insurrections will be the signal of the extermination of the whole black population in the quarter of the state where it occurs." It is interesting to note that Governor Floyd wrote in his diary, November 21st, 1831, that he wished to have a law passed gradually abolishing slavery in his state. More than a few people in the South, as well as the North, were leaning toward that solution. But slaveholders were the ruling class, and they controlled the state houses. Like Pharaoh, whose heart was hardened when Moses told him to let my people go, slaveholders would not budge when it came to any form of abolition. If Virginia had begun a gradual emancipation process, other states might have followed, especially in Kentucky, Tennessee, and Maryland. And history might have been quite different. Wow. So that was an interesting story. It comes from the book Rebels Against Slavery, American Slave Revolts by Patricia C. McKissack and Frederick L. McKissack Sr. I've had this book for a very long time now, and never really thought about doing an episode from it. But with Juneteenth just passing and the 4th of July coming up, it made sense to do a story. Now, my initial plan was to just do, a nice little freedom folktale like I normally do, but something kept eating at me to do Nat Turner, and I'm glad I did it. If you've seen the movie Birth of a Nation, the 1916 version by the artist, the actor Nate Parker, then you probably remember some of these scenes that I just read to you. There's also a book about people eating Nat Turner's body after he was killed. And one, I think that's horrific, that to think about people being cannibals at the time. And it makes me wonder how many other enslaved Africans were eaten, for trying to get free. Now, don't get me wrong. I do not support or say that you should kill anybody. But when you are in a time of slavery and when they're preaching from the Bible as to why you should be a slave, and we know biblical people like to say an eye for an eye. Well, a few, slave masters dying in this rebellion would not equate to the amount of enslaved Africans and indigenous people were killed throughout slavery. You know what I mean? I'm not going to get too deep into this. This is a very heavy subject, and I will put a disclaimer on this episode that it might not be, depending on the age of the child, they might not be ready for this story. Okay, but if you feel your child is ready, then please let them listen to it. One thing I do want to say is maybe it's the climate that we live in today, and that part about how people reacted after the rebellion and trying to let me just read it again. Here we go. Whites in Petersburg, Virginia, reported that 500 slaves were marching their way. People were sure that Turner had an army waiting in the swamps, ready to sweep down on the people and murder them in their sleep. That we would call the guilt of, I'll be honest, they say they call it white guilt. You know what I mean? You think, and don't get me wrong, he very much could have, if and this is just personal, the traitor wouldn't have informed the slave master. And to this day, we have people still with that mindset not to have unity. But we're not going to get political right here, okay? But yeah, and also that I love this part. He pled not guilty because he didn't feel guilty. Because why would you? You've seen these people kill, destroy, and harm your families murder your kids, murder your spouses, and then you get retribution for that. Justified murder in most cases, if you think about it, how during Reconstruction, the Klan and people would kill and lynch black people just for looking at white women, or looking at them wrong, or speaking up for themselves. Of course, he's not going to feel guilty when, he's seen so much done to him. And I have to agree with him. He wasn't guilty, but that is supposed to be held up for God to, judge those who have done wicked. But I guess sometimes people have to take things into their own hands. So if I lose a few listeners after this episode and this analysis, I understand. It's a tough one. It's tough to do the real stuff and not just the mythological and folklore. Every now and again, I'll throw one of these in there. Just keep you on your toes. All right? Well, by all means, go see Chef. No, he won't have any human remains for you to eat. But I'm pretty sure he'll have a wonderful, wonderful recipe. This was a dark episode and very much needed to remind us of what people can do, what people will do. All right? So, until next time, until we meet again on this voyage, as always, have a blessed day. Welcome to the Galley. I am your chef, and today we have a wonderful recipe inspired by the stories you have just heard. Today, we will be creating collard greens with cornmeal dumplings. Now, what will you need for this delicious recipe? For the smoky soul stock, 2 smoked ham hocks or smoked turkey wings, your preference, 2 medium quartered onions, 4 celery stalks, including leaves halved, 2 carrots, trimmed and quartered, 2 garlic cloves, peeled and smashed, half a teaspoon of black peppercorns, and 2 bay leaves. For the greens and dumplings, 1.5 quarts of smoky soul stock, half a cup of chopped onions, 1 garlic clove minced, 1 pound of collard greens, 2 small dried red chili peppers or 1 teaspoon crushed red pepper flakes, 3/4 a teaspoon of salt plus more for taste, black pepper, half a cup of all-purpose flour, 1.5 cups coarsely ground cornmeal, 1 teaspoon baking powder, 1 teaspoon granulated sugar, and 2 tablespoons unsalted butter, and of course salt to taste. Now, how do we put this together? Easy. Making the smoky soul stock. In a large, heavy stock pot, bring 3 quarts of water, the smoked meat, onions, celery, carrots, garlic, peppercorns, and bay leaves to a boil. Reduce the heat and simmer, partially covered, until the flavors are well blended, about 2.5 hours. The broth develops a stronger flavor the longer you let it simmer. Now, remove the meat from the broth. When cool enough to handle, pull it off the bones. Discard the skin, fat, and bones. We do not need them. Chop the meat and reserve for another use. Use a fine mesh sieve to strain the stock. Refrigerate the stock until the fat floats to the top. Use a slotted spoon to skim off the fat and discard. Store the stock tightly covered in the fridge or freezer. Now, to make the collard greens with cornmeal dumplings. In a saucepan, bring the stock, onion, and garlic to a boil over high heat. Reduce the heat, cover and simmer while preparing the greens. Now, thoroughly, and I repeat, thoroughly wash the greens and trim away the stems if desired. Discard the stems or chop small. Stack 3 to 4 leaves on a cutting board and roll tightly into a log. Slice the greens crosswise into a 1/4 inch wide ribbons. Place the greens and the chilies in the broth and return to simmer. Now you may cook covered for about 1.5 hours. For very tender greens, that is. If you may cook them less if you have young greens or prefer greens with more chew. Season to taste with salt and black pepper. Spoon out about 1 cup of pot liquor, that is the cooking broth, and set aside. Meanwhile, in a small bowl, whisk together the flour, cornmeal, baking powder, sugar, and a 3/4 teaspoon of salt. In a small saucepan, melt the butter, add the reserved pot liquor, and heat to just below boiling. Remove the pot liquor mixture from the heat and whisk half a cup, into the dry ingredients. Add more if needed, 1 tablespoon at a time. Now, let stand for 5 minutes. When cool enough to handle, use wet fingertips to shape the dough into 6 dumplings, or you may use a big spoon to do this. Now, during the last 15 minutes of the collard's cooking time, carefully drop the cornmeal dumpling into the pot of greens, making sure the dumplings rest in the pot liquor. Cover the pot and simmer until the dumplings are cooked through. About 10 to 15 minutes should do. Now, you serve the greens and dumplings in a bowl with plenty of pot liquor. And that is it, my friends. Now, go. Do what you do. Make this recipe yours. And until I have another wonderful recipe for you, remember the rebellion of Nate and his story. And until next time, my friends, as always, enjoy.
And that brings an end to another voyage. May these tales inspire, connect, and nourish your soul, just as Chef's dish fills your belly. Until next time, keep exploring, learning, and sharing the ancestors' stories. Fair winds and following seas.